It's a common stereotype to think that narcissistic abuse primarily happens to women, since they're the most vocal group. But actually, the rates of narcissism is nearly equal for both men and women. In this episode, Brent McLaury, a social media activist and advocate on gender issues, joins Tara and me to discuss his experience of narcissistic abuse, as well as the challenges men face in abusive relationships. Thank you for joining us on Breaking Free from Narcissistic Abuse. I'm Dr. Kerry Kerr McAvoy, a mental health specialist with over 20 years of counseling experience.
And I'm Tara Blair Ball, a certified relationship coach.
This is a listener-supported podcast. Please consider becoming a supporter of the show for less than a cup of coffee. You can see a link in the show notes below. So we're so excited today because Tara and I are introducing a guest, Brent McLaury. I don't know if you are aware of him on social media, but he talks a lot about patriarchy, misogyny, relationships between men and women, and a lot of the stereotypes that we get wrong about each other, particularly that men have about women and women's relationship. But I recently discovered that he's also been an abuse survivor. So I am excited to have him here to tell us more about what that experience is like from a male perspective. So Brent, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So as you said, my name's Brent, and I have kind of fallen into kind of making social media content. I did it sort of by accident. I just saw that there was a lot of kind of content on misogyny, a lot of false narratives being spun. And so I kind of just started making content to kind of correct that from a men's perspective. And that kind of took off. And so now I'm kind of built a platform where I'm speaking directly to men, talking about misogyny, talking about some of the things that we get wrong in society, some of the things that we might be unaware of, things like subtle sexism, the way that sexism shows up that men might not be aware of, to just kind of educate and really just kind of spread that message.
I love that you do that because you root it in research, which breaks down a lot of the arguments, because people have this commonly go back and forth and just get into this contention. Like it's almost like a he said, she said feel. But what you do is you find the research and then support it and then talk about how it's related, and that which deflates the argument. And I really, really appreciate it. But recently, and you did a fall series about your own experiences. What kind of prompted you to do that, to come forward and share some of that?
I think it's just, it's my frustration that, we don't often hear about male victims of abuse and domestic violence. It's not an often talked about subject. And when it is, that conversation is typically usually brought up just as a weapon, as a tool to kind of foil against the idea that men are abusive. It's always pointed to well, look at these statistics. And you said, I bring up a lot of research and I talk about a lot of statistics. The thing about that is, yes, they're really helpful in kind of shaping an overall picture, but they don't really tell the personal stories. Yeah. And so throughout October of the Domestic Violence Awareness Month, I wanted to share that just to show really that this perception that I think we have of men don't really talk about it and they don't really get support and don't really get validated isn't really necessarily the case. And that you can have a conversation about male victims, talk about the situations we find ourselves in and the issues that make us reluctant to talk about it, how we end up in that situation, and do so and show that there is support for men when they talk about these issues.
Yeah, Brent. So I love that you bring in research, but I think the difficulty with research, especially with male abuse victims, is it's so often underreported, that there's this stigma. So what do you see in terms of you as an abuse survivor, as well as engaging with other men about that aspect of it, of it's underreported, they don't really chat about it? Do you feel like in a way your platform is helping to remove that stigma and to encourage abuse survivors to step forward?
I hope so. And I think that was a large part of why I did that series, was just hoping to show other men and then kick it over. And a number of men that are on my platform did then respond by sharing their own stories and talking about it. But I think, a lot of the dynamics are the same for just, all victims, right? There's that guilt and shame of opening up, of I'm in this position, and there's a sense somehow that you deserve it or that this is your fault. And so it can be very difficult to open up and talk about that. If there's violence or sexual assault, there can also be a sense that in some part you didn't stop it. You should be able to stop it, especially as a man, right? You're a big, strong, tough man. You should be able to say no and stop this. And if you don't, that somehow you enjoy it or you want it. And again, that can make it hard to have those conversations, because whether that is the perception, that's the perception you're carrying and projecting onto how others are going to view your story. And I think there's also a sense of, for men, you are a failure or you're less of a man if you are a victim. Just the idea of, I love that we call it like survivors, right? Because it takes away some of that stigma of being a victim, because that does kind of conjure up those ideas of, something that is being happening to you, that you're very passive in it. And I think it's hard for men to get away from that perception when talking about their stories of victimization and abuse. For me as well, the fear was a big factor. My abuser was somebody who was very good at triangulating, of using my social relationships, of kind of interjecting themselves in there and then trying to turn them against me. And so there was a sense of, if I was talking to somebody else or opening up about it, that not only would the situation at home get worse, but then they would try to seek out and destroy that relationship and try to turn that person against me. So it was like, I don't want to bring them into my mess. This is my mess. I have to deal with it. I have to deal with it alone and kind of shoulder that burden. And that's very self-destructive.
Yeah. One of the stereotypes is that toxic relationships are primarily male dominated. And the old statistics and research on narcissism showed that it was primarily a male problem. Although the new research coming out shows, and new numbers come out and show that it's actually nearly 50-50. There's nearly 50% of the narcissists in the world are female and 50% are male. Not quite, but it's very, very close. What do you think men miss when it comes to identifying a female perpetrator? Because we talk a lot in the field about mothers as narcissists, but we never talk about girlfriends or wives. So what are we failing to see?
Yeah, I think, the big thing is that men generally don't have this conversation, right? I think when you look, and that was really as I start to make this content and come into feminist spaces and see a lot of women creators and talking about these things, narcissistic abuse is a very big topic, right? In male spaces, it just isn't. I don't ever remember being taught about it. I don't remember these conversations with friends. And at no point when I brought this person into my life and into my family and into my home, was there ever a consideration that this person could be a threat. Because I just think generally we don't have that sense of threat or an awareness outside, right? Our sense of threat is covering the exits because there might be a gunman or a shooter. That kind of personal, intimate violence in the home, and especially emotional violence, just isn't there. We don't really talk or educated about it at all, really. So I think, for me as well, I never really pieced together much of the same kind of gaslighting that I experienced from my mother into my personal relationships as well. So I missed a lot of it. I think that was the hard thing as well, is being in that abusive relationship. I felt we were struggling. I felt this was somebody who had some traumatic experiences and was kind of acting out based off those. But I never really saw that relationship as abusive. I just saw it was something that I need to work harder or pull through or help them through. It was very difficult to get to that space of, I need to think about myself. I need to think about my son, and what this is doing. And it wasn't until things got so bad that I called the police and had them come out on a domestic violence call that even kind of entered in. Was, they responded with 3 police officers. One of them was a female officer. They separated us, talked to us. And then she came to a side to me and basically said, look, right now, you guys are all agreeing on your story. She got drunk. She was abusive. All it takes is for that to change slightly, for her to point to some of the bruises and say, you did those. And then all of a sudden you could lose your access to your son. Your whole life turns around. I never really thought about that. Like, it was just never really something. Like the fact that we were in that abusive relationship was just, that was part of our dynamic. That was the things that we had to work through. I never really thought of what is at risk here. It's why it's important for us to talk about it, because there is that huge risk. There is these dynamics that you need to think about when coming to that. And so it's we wade into these situations without realizing the risks or the danger that are inherent.
Well, it really kind of brings me to a follow-up question. And this is a theory I have. It's a working theory, and I'd love to know what you think. So back in the 1970s, maybe late 70s, early 80s, there was a big research study that came out that looked at gender stereotypes. In fact, I actually went to graduate school with one of the researchers. And it was a very simple experiment. They put a list of adjectives like confident, bold, whiny, cries easily, just this list of descriptors. And then they asked college students to select the ones that best described a healthy man, select the ones that best describe a healthy woman, and then select the ones that describe a mental patient. And the research found that women correlated and looked the same as mental health patients, meaning that we pathologize women's behaviors. We have this sense that women are weaker, needier, passive, emotional. Is it possible, this is my theory, is it possible that one reason we miss toxic women is because in general, when we look at women as a whole group, particularly men looking at women as a whole group, they tend to think women in these unhealthy ways. So then when they actually meet an unhealthy woman, they can't see her because they have this projection of all women being like that. That's just one of my, I don't know. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think this, I feel like there's a danger there of putting all women into that box. But I think there's a lot of language that we use, right? You're being crazy, you're being hysterical, where we normalize women's behavior as, dismissive of mental illness in that way. So what we're doing there is we're not necessarily saying that we can't identify between the two, but what we're doing is we're so trivializing mental illness. We're so trivializing those things of abuse, the behaviors and the patterns that we should be seeing, that it almost then becomes a meaningless conversation when you want to have conversations about abuse, right? I think of how gaslighting, I'm sure you're probably very frustrated with how gaslighting has now become a very popular term, and any sort of like, oh, you're lying becomes, oh, you're telling me you're gaslighting me, where gaslighting is a very specific behavior. And what we've done is now trivialized it so that when you do talk about narcissistic abuse or abusive relationships and you talk about the practice of gaslighting, it doesn't even register because you're like, oh, it just means that they're, saying that I'm lying. And it's deeper than that. I think that is definitely a struggle in educating about abusive relationships with men, in that if you've already got a view that every complaint from a woman or every accusation against you is, her just being hysterical, her just being so demanding, and, this is the way that women are, then you can't have a real conversation about, okay, these are the dangerous behaviors that we need to look out for. These are the things you should be on the lookout for, because you've normalized this to be, well, that's just women. And it's not.
Right. And then men are more likely than to accidentally step into a relationship. I know that I have a very complex perspective of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, but
yeah,
it's easy to have met somebody that can have hysterical qualities and think, oh, but women are hysterical. So there's nothing unique about her and nothing dangerous about her because of her behavior.
Yeah, and that whole case was very triggering for me when I first heard about it, and stuff, because I think my first exposure to it was the videotape of her, or the audio tape of her saying, like, tell the world nobody's going to believe you and all of this stuff. You're a man of that. And that hit me to my core, because that was, part of my experience was like, this whole idea of like, oh, that's it. You're going to tell people you're getting beat up by a woman, you're a fucking pussy and all this stuff. Like, and it's hard, right? Because then you take that into that whole discussion of their relationship, and you're like, okay, well, this person's the evil person or this person's the abuser because you're projecting your own experiences on it. And that whole case was such a complex mix of how intertwined violence gets in an abusive relationship, how difficult it can be to wade into an abusive relationship and find out, like, we want the good guy and we want the bad guy, and the relationships are not necessarily as clear cut as that. And I think that's also part of the issue of men talking and being open about their experiences of abuse, because it's very difficult to have those conversations, especially about reciprocal violence, without the immediate takeaway being, well, what did he do to cause her to be violent to him? Oh, if he's violent back, then it's really he's the abuser. And it's hard to have those complex questions without like wanting to take those very simple takeaways of, it's an abusive man, it's a violent man. If there is anything coming back his way, well, then he's clearly starting it or deserving of it.
I think it'd be important just to take a pause and really highlight the types of abuse that men experience in relationships, because particularly with my male clients who are abuse victims, as in when I'm working with them, they're in the middle of the situation. So they're not a survivor yet because they're still in the middle of the shit. What I see most commonly is that these men have no idea that what's happening is abusive. They have this deep understanding that it's not okay, that it's not right. That's why they're seeking out help, but they cannot see it as that abuse. Like, that's a very hard label for them to grasp. And I do think it's important to just highlight the different types. You've definitely highlighted, emotional abuse, which can be like screaming, name calling, that kind of thing, threats. What are other types of abuse that you see in common to men-female relationships?
So I think one, again, like in that sense of like that reciprocal violence, one of the things I experienced was the abuse wasn't always physical. A lot of times it was kind of emotional and psychological. And it was done in a way to push buttons. the end goal of it was really to kind of get a provocation out of me, to get a response out of me, because there is that sense of like, well, okay, if he's violent back, well then, he's lost his cool and he's the one that's angry and he's the abusive one. Because in abusive relationships, right, the abuser always wants to kind of paint themselves as the victim and turn things around to make it like, oh, they're the bad guy. And so that was one of the things that I was not prepared for and took a lot of control, was because I knew that all of these behaviors were about provoking a reaction and needling you into doing that. And I think that's something for male victims that is more of a pressing problem and a threat of like, okay, you really have to keep a lid on things. You really have to control yourselves, because things can go badly very, very quickly. I think the other one that I think men are susceptible more to is how sexuality is often used and intimacy as a weapon inside an inside an abusive relationship. One of the things I encountered was like we would have these huge fights. We would have these, it would be done, everything would be off, and then there would be a turn to like being really intimate and using that and that intimacy to smooth over all of the emotional cracks, and so that then like, oh, everything's forgotten about and you're gone because you're getting those physical needs met. And it was kind of understanding that, oh, this is actually being used as a weapon, right? This is not a sense of we're actually trying to heal or move things up. It was a way to basically get you to shut up and ignore the problems. And again, I don't think we really talk about that. A lot of times when men talk about red flags in abusive relationships, the only red flags we talk about are she's a gold digger, she's going to cheat on you. We never talk about these kind of things. And like you said, the different types and ways in which it shows up in a relationship. Of there can be physical violence, there can be emotional manipulation, there can be the psychological, right? I came into that relationship, I was very confident. I've heard a lot of female friends talk about abusive relationships, and I always considered that I was too confident, too arrogant, too full of myself to ever let somebody break me down in that way. And within, I think, 2 or 3 months of being with this person, I was questioning my entire reality. They were telling me I was a narcissist and I was abusive, and I was really struggling with, oh my gosh, I am this horrible, terrible person. And I really believed all of it and was, walking on eggshells, trying to do what I could. Even things like setting boundaries of what were inappropriate relationships with other people. I was like, oh, I'm being too controlling, I'm being too domineering, and trying to find a way to set boundaries and express your needs without coming off as, you're just another abusive, narcissistic man. And I'm like, oh gosh, I don't know how to do any of this. And that was, again, something I was unprepared for and had no idea about, because, it just, the sense that somebody would come into a relationship and break your entire identity and self-worth, I didn't even think that was possible.
Yeah.
I just want to add a couple that I have seen definitely with clients is there's, in a way, the female abuser can use patriarchy to their benefit by threatening manhood. Like, you're not a real man.
Yeah.
If you're a real man, you would do this. And like you mentioned, that pushing those buttons can absolutely make someone react. And then there's not enough knowledge about reactive abuse for people to understand that it was a reaction. It wasn't abusive. It was a reaction to abuse. The other thing that I see that is not talked about enough is using children as pawns. You're never going to see your kids again. I'm going to make sure that, I have full custody. You're going to be paying me out for the rest of your life. Those are things that I see that can keep men really stuck and trapped in these abusive relationships that make it extremely difficult to want to leave, because you think, I'm never going to see my kids again. No one's going to ever believe me, like the Amber Heard, Johnny Depp trial. But I like how you mentioned sex as a tool or a weapon. I also think that that's just another way that can be used for the power and control aspect of abuse, of saying, well, I will only have sex with you if you do X, that sort of manipulation. That aspect is something I see very commonly, not only to smooth intimacy, but also to get the person to do what you want them to do, which abuse is all about power and control. And, like we've been chatting about, we don't necessarily look at women and think, oh, they have power and control, but they can in these dynamics because they cut you down. They, take over the finances. I also often see financial abuse, financial infidelity, spending money that the other person isn't aware of, or controlling the money, or nitpicking and criticizing finances. It does have all of the dynamics of a male-female relationship, but the stigma is, oh, well, he could just leave. He can handle it. He can work. He deserved it. He caused it. That it does make it so much more difficult to leave, especially when you think if children are at play. I see that as the most common reason why men stay in these abusive relationships is because they are so concerned about never seeing their kids again.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was definitely consideration, and a huge part of what my reluctance to leave was, when you are not in the stronger financial situation in an abusive relationship, it can be hard to leave because you're just not able to, right? You don't have anywhere to go. You might not be able to afford a place to move out on your own and things like that. But when you are in the place where you're financially dominant, right? Like mine was the guilt of, okay, if I do end this relationship, what's going to happen to them? Where are they going to go? What's going to happen to them and to them and their family and all of this? And again, it took that conversation with the police officer who's like, look, you need to be focused on you and your son. And yes, it sucks. Yes, it's miserable, right? I understand you have a good heart and you want to be worried about these things, but you have to put that first and protect yourself. And this is somebody that you care a great deal for. This is somebody you're in a relationship with. That is incredibly difficult, to cut that piece of yourself off and to be calloused, basically, to be cold. It's very difficult. And knowing that you are in that situation where you're like, okay, if I do this, I don't know what's going to happen to them. I don't know where they're going to go. That's really hard.
Yeah. And there's also that fear of what other man is going to be in your child's life. I hear that a lot too, of like, well, if I leave, who else is going to be there, and it's a lot at play that we don't necessarily think as much about other types of abuse situations.
Yeah. And because they had come from an abusive relationship before with violence. And that was the other part of the story, right? You come in and you're told, oh, this other person was the violent one. They were the abusive one. And you're like, oh my gosh, what a common and familiar story, right? If you date women, you are well aware that all of them have a story of the abusive men in their life that ruined it. So you're like, okay. And then, like I said, you get into it into a couple of months and then you're like, oh, hang on a second. I don't necessarily think they were the problem. But then you are concerned because then you know that if they move out, they go off and do their things, who's next in line? Who are those kids going to be looked after next? And yeah, it's I mean, I still it's been years and I'm still like, oh, I feel bad about, like, are they okay? Are they taken care of? And learning to let go of that is difficult.
So to wrap this up, what do you think is a key piece that you would really want to leave with the men listening to this episode? What can they begin to maybe think about or be looking for, consider that really might help them see it? Just like you had that officer in your life come in and say, warn you, listen, this is going to turn on you in a bad direction. What is it that you'd like men to know if they're in the situation?
Yeah, I think, the first thing is I think we just need to educate other men about what abusive relationships look like, and especially that narcissistic abuse and things like that. I think you'd had Lisa Sony on as a guest a few episodes back, and her content is fantastic about it. It's she's an advocate for both male and female victims and talks a lot about it. I think it's great content to kind of suck that up. But obviously, anybody who's doing that work of talking about the abusive relationship, like yourselves, this is a great place to start. Looking for what are the warning signs, what are those kind of abusive behaviors that I need to be aware of. I think the other thing is just recognizing that while there are fewer resources for men, there are resources, right? Both the US and the UK have domestic violence hotlines that you can talk to. So if you do not have somebody in your life that you can share with and talk to, there is at least those. But I also think it is, if you can, building that social circle to be able to have somebody to talk to, because we don't tend to talk about it. We don't tend to share what is going on with us, and it's so important to have an outside voice because, again, when you're in that situation, your entire identity and self-worth gets crumbled into nothing, and you need that external validation. Coming out of that relationship, therapy was really useful for me for that because it gave me a third party that I could talk to about my behaviors and the way they were. Like, I'm setting boundaries in this way and I'm saying these things. Is this problematic? And they're like, oh yes, you should rephrase this. I can see why this is a problem. Oh no, you're totally fine. This is a perfectly normal way of expressing boundaries. It was really helpful in regaining that sense of, am I actually a problem? Am I actually abusive? Because you will get toned down. And so having somebody to talk to is vital. Yeah. And I think then the other thing is just, like I said, that knowing of that danger of reciprocity in an abusive relationship, and because there is such a stigma for men, there is the assumption that in a violent relationship you are the perpetrator. Emotional regulation is such an underplayed skill in men, and I think it's really important to know when you feel yourself becoming activated and being able to do whatever it is that you need to have those highly emotional conversations in a less charged way. For me, it's pausing in the middle of that conversation and saying, hey, I need 5 or 10 minutes to just let these emotions set, and so that then I can talk rationally, logically through what's happened and how we can fix the behavior, so that I'm not yelling and screaming and just, speaking from a place of anger and hurt. Other people, they like to talk about it through first. Other people like to write it down. It's just learning what is helpful to you to have those conversations in a less charged way, because that will help. It will frustrate the heck out of them because their whole purpose is to get you into that state and to do that. But it'll also help you in identifying that behavior, because you'll see that they won't give you that space to come down. They won't give you that. And you can start to say, okay, this is not healthy. They want me activated. They want me emotional. And they're doing that because this is abuse, and they really want me to hurt them back. And then they can play victim.
I also would just add, from what I see from my male clients, is there is a great need for my male clients to learn the language of feelings in general. So like, what is this feeling? How do you identify it? Because so many of my clients come to me and they're like, I know something's not right, but they can't label. They don't have, the wherewithal to be able to label it. They just know something's not right. And it's taken them a lot of effort to come to someone for help. That's always a difficulty that I see with my male clients, is they don't want to admit that they need help, that something's going wrong, that they can't fix it themselves. But if there was a language that they could learn specifically for identifying and explaining their feelings, they might be able to better see it, just like what you were talking about, Brent, with just being able to be like, okay, so she is pushing my buttons. That's obviously what she's desiring to do in this situation. So I need to be aware of, why would that be? Why would she want to push my buttons? That kind of thing. And being able to see it as part of an overall pattern. But it really does have to start with, can I figure out what I'm feeling? Can I identify what I'm feeling? Why I'm having that feeling? Have I expressed to this person that I really don't like when they threaten my manhood, or they use a specific word, and yet here they are again saying it? So very obviously trying to push buttons, but it does require that level of effort. And I think getting therapy, checking out some books. I really love the book Couple Skills by Matthew McKay. It's one of the most wonderful relationship books that I recommend to people. But I think resources like that can just really give you a sense of, okay, this is what I'm feeling. I need to be able to identify this. And also, what can I do that's normal and healthy? Because I think so many of my male clients just really haven't seen a lot of healthy relationships. So it's not surprising that they would then get in an unhealthy relationship themselves. They think it's normal. Oh yeah, all women yet just yell and scream at their partners, and it's not supposed to be how it is, and that's not what we should tolerate either.
Thank you so much for being a part of this today. And if people want to find your content, where should they look for you?
So my content is on TikTok under the name Expatriarch. So that's predominantly where I am, but we're also launching next month a podcast aimed at men at menaren'tok.com. So,
I love that.
One of the early conversations that we're going to have is about male victims of violence, and also why it is that men just don't have that sense of danger and awareness about violence when, statistically they're more likely to encounter violence in their lives than it. So yeah, we're going to talk about that and what men can do to better prepare themselves. Well,
thank you so much for being on today. This was a fantastic conversation, and I
thanks for being
here. One of many more that we have with you. So thank you so much for being here today.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you, guys.
Thank you for joining us today. Have a question or comment? Email us at hello@breakingfreewithcarrieandtara.com. If this episode's been helpful, consider becoming a supporter. And if you haven't yet, make sure to follow us at Breaking Free from Narc Abuse on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. We'll see you back here next time.